When I think flat pack, build it yourself, my mind turns to more disposable furniture and getting lost in a massive warehouse, but this tiny thing is quite the opposite. And though the sandwich, it doesn't come with a side of Swedish meatballs, this is one heck of a fantastisk sub 10 liter case. Welcome to Machines and More. This first look today is going to kick off a little case series on this tiny powerhouse. This is the FormD T1 V2 sandwich here in the flesh, and wow, it's a whole lot of fun. The case comes in at 9.95 liters, basically 10 liters, but technically under 10 liters. And this update brings about a fairly substantial set of updates in terms of the capability, compatibility, and options, and we'll cover all that today. But since this is a little different in that you have to put it together, I'll walk you through assembling the case first. I'll also show you what it comes with, and even though I will cover some build tips very briefly, I'll go into more detail on that and specific component recommendations in a separate video. But for the first look today, we'll cap it off with some performance benchmarks and comparisons against some other cases that you might be considering in this size bracket. So first off, a big thanks to FormD for providing the media kit here today. This review is not sponsored by them, but this video does have a sponsor, and how about I tell you about a sponsor today, and then we'll get into what's in the box here. Today's video sponsor is FlexiSpot, and you'll notice I've got their Canna Pro bamboo standing desk here. I've used this desk pretty extensively, and it's great as a sit-stand desk for gaming and working, but lately I've found it super useful as a modular work surface, and I've leveraged it for filmmaking here on the channel. The smooth height adjustable legs make it really easy to dial in the perfect height for me when I'm alternating between doing builds, showing all of you the details during reviews, and I can do this. And then I can bring it back down lower to this height. It's been a very useful tool here. It's stable and durable to work with. My butterfingers have on occasion dropped plenty of tools on it, and this bamboo, it's held up really nicely. Right now they're starting to run their brand day promos, so go on over and check them out. There are some pretty sweet deals to be had if you're looking for a sit-stand desk for your next battle station. Alright, so it's like a pastry box when you get it. Everything is flat packed and it's neatly organized out of the box. You'll find everything arranged in foam cutouts. You'll have the riser cable, either 3.0 and 4.0, depending on what you pick. This one is the center divider that holds the riser cable. Look at that beautifully machined rear panel here. Look at that sweet CNC quality and anodization. Yeah, quality. Rear I/O panel, front panel. Rad brackets, you can choose between full length and half length for 120mm. We'll get into that discussion later, which one you would use. Top and bottom panels, they're the same, so you can just flip the case however you like. These are the horizontal case members, optional mesh acrylic panel, and the aluminum mesh panels. PSU cage and some other small parts. And let's just organize everything. And I found the foam insert that came with the case perfect for organizing the screws so that you don't lose track of anything. A couple of main screws to note: almost everything here is M3, and you'll have two countersunk ones at either 5mm or 8mm. Just look at the pieces that you're joining together to determine which screw length to use, and these are the flathead M3 by 4mm screws here as well. And there will be times when there is no countersunk drill that you'll use these. With everything identified and organized, you can start putting it together. It might seem a little bit intimidating, but I actually found it quite logical as long as you get started off right, and hopefully this video helps give you a good idea on how to do that. Right now there is a rudimentary manual, but even then it's not complete, and the parts, they do fit together so perfectly with very good tolerances, so you'll pretty much know right away that if you're doing something wrong. First step is to put together the I/O plate and the rear plate. This is one of the new features here because you can customize the amount of spacing you give to the MOBO side and the GPU. And that's pretty important since GPUs have changed a lot in the last 2 years in terms of the cooler sizes. I'll be doing this build with the EVGA XC3 3080. This one's the more SFF friendly 3080. It comes in at about 2.25 slots is what they would call it. Now I could give more clearance on the motherboard side for this case, but I did want to push the card out a little bit more from the center divider, so I'll opt to scoot the Mobo out a notch and use 5mm standoffs to push out the riser cable just a little bit, and this will fit our AIO almost perfectly on the motherboard side. Next, the riser cable strut, put in the motherboard standoffs as well onto this thing. You can also put the riser cable on right now if you want, but I'm going to wait on this one since it's not a difficult thing to put in. And I also want to gauge the length of the standoff to use. Plus this cable, it's just going to get in the way, so we can leave it off for now. This is how the center support bar goes in. Make sure that the hole you choose corresponds to the hole you spaced the motherboard divider to. These are the side rails. You'll put one on each side. They slot into the back plate, and you'll just go ahead and put all your Mobo standoffs on. We can do the power button next. This is the only default I/O item that comes with the case. I believe you can option on a USB-C header that would fit to the other side of the front panel that has the same hole size. Attach the PSU cage. There are a few positions, so you can still shift it later if you want a better position. All right, so one thing I'd absolutely recommend doing, this is a unique feature of the T1, space out that SFX power supply with 5mm standoffs. You can attach the cage directly to the divider if you want, but it's a really good idea to give a little bit of room behind it. You'd be surprised how much of a difference this makes, and this is especially important if you have a flow-through type of GPU cooler, such as the Founders Edition Ampere cards, as well as many AIB cards nowadays. This is similar to the mod I did with the Q58, but you can do this really easily with the components out of the box. And I did have to use the included 5mm standoffs for the riser cable when I spaced it out, and I had to come up with a few extras on my own. So I'll go ahead and leave the M3 standoff kit linked down below. And then go ahead and attach the power cable. Figure out how you want to run it. It's L-shaped, so you'll have to pick a side. One thing you have to do is determine the length of the standoff required between the riser strut and the side rail. There's a myriad of standoffs in the box, and you'll just add 1 centimeter for each screw hole that you space the motherboard out by. I did space out the riser cable for that 5mm to give the back plate side of the card a little breathing room. And then I'll go ahead and attach the riser cable. And here I'm just going to be test fitting the card to make sure that it fits properly, which it appears to bring the fans out to the outermost position, so that's good. Here we have the GPU hanger, which slots into the side of the I/O plate. We can roughly position it at this point. Towards the end, after the card is in, you can then cover up the remaining gaps around the GPU with these small plates, so don't lose track of those. One thing you can do at this point is install the radiator or the fan plate. These are completely optional though, and you might want to wait until you're further into the build to determine how you use that, but this is how you would install them. But you're gonna see, I'm not gonna be using them, and I'll tell you why shortly. With the exception of the top and the bottom, and the side panels, which will go on when you're ready to close up your build, that's it. And I really like how these V2 side panels just hang in place. That's a really cool design here. All right, so that's basically it. It might seem complicated, but it really isn't. And with that done, I'll talk through some specs here. This is all 6000 series aluminum. You saw how good and incredibly well CNC'd this thing was, and this anodization is some of the best that I've ever seen. There's a limited amount of height, so you will have to make sure that your GPU is around 140mm of width at most in the sandwich configuration. You will still need to give some space for your power connectors. We have roughly 30mm left here, and this card is about 110mm, so that 140mm number seems about right. The length, max length, about 320, officially 323mm. So with the power supply and the motherboard in, let's validate some other clearances here. GPU thickness clearance, keep in mind that I've shifted the riser out 5mm, and it has an additional screw hole left. So if we were to push out the motherboard another 10mm, the max works out to be about 60-ish millimeters here. There's a little recess on the side panel, so figure just a little bit more than 3 slots. And here I set up 45mm, which is optimal for the XE3 cooler. CPU cooler clearance, keeping in mind that this is directly in contest with the amount of space that you give your GPU. It's a little hard to see, but my reference point here gives me just a little bit over 60 millimeters. If we were to keep to a strict 2-slot 40 millimeter GPU without any riser cable standoffs, as rare as that might be today, you'll get 10 millimeters more, and the official spec here is 73 millimeters in this mode. The max you can have is 88 millimeters, and that is with a 1.25 slot, or basically a single slot card. Rad or fan clearance, if you use the plates, it's going to be 46 millimeters on the Mobo side, and if you only use the half-length rad plates, you can have a lot more under the power supply side. And so this is completely subject to the cabling and your tubing if you're running an AIO there, and I'm assuming you're not going to be running a 45 millimeter rad here, right? So I wouldn't go too crazy though, because with the average amount of cables out of an SFX power supply, you will have a reasonable amount of space for a sub 30 millimeter AIO rad plus a 25 millimeter fan there. So technically this case does support SFX-L supplies, but I would strongly recommend against it, especially if you're doing an AIO build, because we are talking sub 10 liters here and every millimeter of space counts. For the initial build here, I'm putting in my current test kit consisting of the B550 ISU Sport, the 3700X CPU, and the PL240 AIO from Cooler Master. This rad is on the thinner side, which is great, and it's closer to 25 millimeters. This pump is also low profile, and it has pivoting elbows, and with the exception of the very thick tubing, it's a pretty good fit for this case. And if you recall, I'm working with about 60 millimeters of space here, so we do need to be a little bit conscious of that. I'd recommend building the case with the horizontal member removed, and you'll know how to take that off because you put it in, or don't put it in at all. But with that out of the way, it's a surprisingly easy case to build into. So with the clearances available here, I opted to go for a 125 millimeter Noctua NFA 12x25 under the PSU, and one NFA 12x15 under the motherboard. And because of the asymmetrical arrangement, it does tend to be a little bit easier to forego the rad plates. Those would be useful for having 2 fans only, or a 120 millimeter AIO if you're using the half-length brackets. And perhaps if you're running dual slim fans on your radiator, you can use the full-length brackets. But my preference here would be to give as much room for the airflow. So attaching the rad directly to the bottom of the case is my recommendation. And then you can just put the radiator in place, secure the top or bottom in place, however you want to orient it. And then you'll notice that the holes line up thoughtfully and perfectly with the spacing for a 120 millimeter or 240 millimeter fan in rad. Unfortunately, the screws might stick out a little bit, so if you have countersunk 632 rad screws like I did, you can use them to make it a little bit more concealed. They're still going to stick out, but normal flathead ones are fine too. But some countersunk holes at the mounting locations, I think that would be a small aesthetic recommendation for a future iteration of this case. All right, so once you pop the card in, you're basically ready to rock. Just plug in the power there for your card and make sure that riser cable is locked down. And then you'll adjust the hanger to line up with the card's I/O bracket and then tighten it down. I did opt to put the rad on top and to put the pump head in the optimal position, which is lower than the radiator. And so with the other panel, I just attached the low profile rubber feet, and you can put them wherever you want, but I put them at the outer edges, and then you can just pop the panels in and close it up with thumb screws. All right, with that done, let's take a look at some comparisons here. The FormD T1 V2 is basically in a league of its own in terms of sizing. Not really a surprise here, but none of the other ones here are sub 10 liters. And your next closest competition will come from the Lianli Dan A4H2, which I reviewed earlier this year. And even that at this point is 11% larger than the T1. And it's a good bit taller because it has a lot thicker feet here. For CPU-only thermals, it's really good. I did hook up the 2 fans separately so I could bias the speed a little bit more towards the 25 millimeter fan, since that noise profile is better than that of the slim Noctua. The goal here with these tests is that these cases come in equivalent in terms of noise, and I have to say here, this is a really good performance result for what is what could be considered as a weaker fan combination simply because of that slim Noctua. For gaming, we're looking pretty good here. The GPU thermals are in the ballpark of those larger sandwich style cases, and in addition to the more compact size here, it does mean that the rad has to be a little bit more cramped and subject to the impact of the GPU's exhaust. Despite that, this is absolutely fine. I think GPU thermals are great here, especially for the XC3 cooler, which is one of your smallest and weaker AIB 3080 coolers. Moving over to the combined stress test, this is not necessarily applicable in the real world for many users, but this gives us an idea of the worst case scenario that you can expect from these cases. And again, being sub 10 liters, you might expect some limitations, and I don't really see that here. If anything, the Shift XT in liquid cooled mode, that was 17 liters. And if you shrink that case down to the tinier modes, the GPU thermals get much worse. So that's just to put things into perspective how good this case is with sub 10 liters. Against the bigger A4H2O, it does appear to be just behind in the thermal tests. And there are a couple key differences here that contribute to that, in case you're wondering. First off, the fan arrangement. Like I mentioned, the T1, it's doing really well, in spite of the fact that one of the CPU radiator fans has to be a slim one. And the other thing we can't overlook is that there's a trade-off here. While the A4H2O does have great thermals, there's absolutely no dust management there, with large holes for maximum airflow. With the T1, the dust management is integrated. Your fans are meant to run an exhaust at the top of the case, and since the side panels will be your source of intake for the makeup air, they're filtered. And though I wasn't bored enough to count them all, it does have 12,000 tiny holes here from what I'm told. So your dust, it's much less of a concern with this case because that is already thought out here. And lastly, the spacing. There's just a little bit more breathing room in the way the A4 is designed. There's a little bit more height there. So a little tiny bit more room for airflow. At any rate, in spite of being 1 liter smaller than the A4H2O, it's still really, really close in terms of the performance. And as a whole, it's performing much better than I expected. With the radiator fans exhausting in these types of cases, you do still have to be careful when pairing higher powered GPUs with higher powered CPUs, just because of the thermal impact on the CPU cooling here when you're using a radiator as exhaust. But for most gaming builds, which should be more GPU focused, or workstation builds, which might be more CPU intensive, this is perfectly sufficient. One last data point for comparison here. This is how these cases stack up in terms of cost. All your other ones are mass manufactured with less meticulous quality, and you're paying for the build quality here. There's no getting around it. There is a lower cost option if you are willing to go with the PCIe 3.0 riser cable for $205. That's where it starts at, and also a plethora of additional options that you can add on. A few initial thoughts for your consideration. First off, I love this case and its features. Comparing it to the Sliger SM550 that I've been running for a little bit now, which is also in that kind of higher end category, it's a little bit smaller than the T1, but this can't even fit a 120mm rad, let alone a 240. And in terms of thermal performance, you're pretty limited. The fact that this T1 V2 can easily support a 240, I mean, if I really wanted to, I could swap this fan out for a T30. It would be a little dicey with the cable management, and it would be maxed out, and there'd be a little bit less room for airflow, but you can. There's 5mm there. And with good cable management, this setup was not even a tight fit. The tubes, yeah, they're a little bit unwieldy, but if you exclude the assembly of the case itself, this build process was arguably easier compared to most of the cases that we compared to. The design and the layout, it's pure magic here, and this really shouldn't be happening in 10 liters. I mean, it just shouldn't. Compatibility is still pretty good. I mean, let's be realistic. Don't go trying to fit an MSI Supreme card in this, but with some compromise on the motherboard's clearance, you can still fit your bigger coolers like your ASUS ROG and your MSI Gaming X Ampere cards. And the fact that the user has fairly granular control over that spacing, it's absolutely amazing. And that way you can dial in the case exactly to how your components will fit together. The fact that you have to put this together, it might be daunting, but it's also fun. And this thing features simple construction. And the one advantage that this has is if you are absolutely pushing the limits of this case, then you can simply build your case around your components versus working in a completely built case. And I actually found this assembly process quite enjoyable, since you do get to know the case inside out and you can map out your cable management master plan as you are putting it together. So it's like you kind of get to do two builds, and it's actually a really pleasurable experience here. The build quality, like I've been touting, it's absolutely unmatched. And honestly, I tried to find something wrong with this, and I kind of wanted to, because this wasn't possible, right? But I couldn't. And I know it was a meticulous process here to find the right manufacturing partner, but seriously, you are absolutely getting what you pay for here, and probably more. So one thing I thought that could use a little bit more refinement here was the PSU cage. It did tend to have a little movement pivoting inwards as the case was being built when it was lying flat, and that's because there doesn't seem to be a way to secure the outermost edge of the cage to the front panel. So I think that would have been preferable. I did put in a screw there just to keep it from pivoting down, but that's not a sustainable solution. So yeah, I think that would have been preferable, along with a way to help cinch up the PSU cable nice and tight against the PSU. That way you make sure that none of the cables are hitting the fans. I did try the mesh acrylic panel. I didn't do any thermal testing in it just yet, but this one is absolutely gorgeous. It's a great idea, great option here, and it's a really unique look. But if you are planning to run it in the Mobo side, it might flex out a little bit if your cables or your cooler tubes just bulge a tiny little bit, so keep that in mind. It's gonna push it out the edges. I think maybe some magnets integrated into the side would have helped with that, if that's going to be a long-term option going forward. Oh yeah, and we haven't even gotten to the fact that it will be convertible to the T1 Reference Edition, which is a standard non-riser cable layout that you can run with the fan underneath C14S type of setup. Now, that conversion part is forthcoming, and I am planning on testing the Reference T1 version as well soon. You can turn this one into a tower with a bracket into a T1 tower. From what I'm seeing so far, if you have a more flexible budget and a compatible build plan, I would hands down choose this over any of the other sandwich style cases. And unfortunately, perhaps the more difficult part of getting this case is getting the case, because there's not much consolidated information or media out there just yet, which thank you for watching this video. But on the purchasing side, for a while now, the T1 drops have sold out in mere minutes. So the best way to stay apprised is the SFF Guru Discord and the FormD subreddit, and I'll leave those linked. But as I understand, the plan is that weekly drops will hopefully resume around the end of June this year. Manufacturing delays and the global supply chain may impact timing as well there, but rough estimate now. You can tell that this project has been a labor of love, and this V2 case, it's much more refined. It's not crowdfunded, but it is very much crowdsourced, because the community's input has gone into making this a better case. Some might call this one minimalist. I call it miraculous, but whatever you call it, it's still an impossible combination of size efficiency, performance, and compatibility. So yes, there are definitely larger options that work well. And yes, there are smaller cases that can be increased in volume and top-hatted to take a 240. But the FormD T1 sandwich out of the box takes a 240 EAO, the other one being the V1 of this case, of course. And there are quite a few possibilities still for a custom loop, such as a combo like the TX240 with your 25mm fans. If you're really intrepid, there is supposedly a way to squeeze in a second rad, so I'll explore that in future content as well. But when considering all that, and the exquisite manufacturing quality, there's nothing quite like this on the landscape. And this is a case that's been further refined to stand alone. I can tell you already that I'm going to be doing a personal build in this one along with a custom loop, so I'm going to upgrade my personal system into this one after we take a look at some air cooling and more of a detailed build guide as well. So please subscribe to stay connected, please give a like, build links are down below. Thanks for watching today.